is the technical support if you need any questions, and just be aware of safety while we're on this call. Just as a reminder, everybody should be muted at the beginning of our workshop. If you have any questions, please use the raise your hand button and unmute yourself when I call on you. We will be having a question and answer session at the end of every presentation. So if you could please just refrain from raising your hand until the question and answer portion, or type your questions in the chat and then we can answer them at that time. I will read the questions aloud, but you are also able to unmute yourself to respond to the answer. We just ask that you remember to mute yourself after you have asked your question. Just some basic ground rules. We want the workshop to be a space to allow the utilities to just present their results of their reports and engage in questions on their methods. So we just want to keep all of our questions friendly and respectful. And please only use the chat feature for questions and comments pertaining to the workshop. And I think that will be great for everyone. Okay. So here is just a sneak peek of our agenda. We've got 3 presentations today. We have PG&E's ART program and their Smart AC pilot. We have SDG&E's non-residential ELRP program. And then we have a SE's summer discount program. Okay. So I think we are ready for our first presenter if they would like to start sharing their screen.
Yes, good morning. This is Wendy Brummer with PG&E. And I'm the primary program manager on the Automated Response Technology program. And Josh Bodie and I will be presenting on ART. And my camera is not enabled. I'd be happy to go on screen, but I don't seem to have that ability to turn on my camera. So if you'd like that, I'm game. So let's see.
1 second. I'll turn on your camera.
Wendy, are you able to see the primary screen or are you seeing the secondary screen right now?
There, I'm seeing the ART presentation.
Okay, just the presentation, not the next slide. Perfect.
Correct. Yes. Yes. So letting you know just what we're going to cover here, a little program background, our key research questions and objectives. Going to talk about the technology, participation, the operations, very important. We'll let you know what this whole program is based on, the evaluation methodology, 2022 load impacts 2023, and the ex ante impacts for planning purposes. Next slide. A little background for the basis for the Automated Response Technology program, which we refer to as ART. We have conducted 3 years of studies and pilots. In 2021, we launched a demand response emerging technology study, which focused on smart thermostats. And that was a very limited study. We confined it to only residential customers who were on TOU rates. And our learning objective was to understand what's the incremental value of demand response for customers who are on TOU rates. It's always been a big question of ours, right? After TOU rates, what's going to be left for DR? So that was 14,000 customers. And in 2022 and 2023, as part of the summer reliability proceedings, we were able to launch what was referred to in filings as the Smart Thermostat Control Pilot. We branded that under another program you might be familiar with, Smart AC. It was in branding only. It was not on tariff. And for this one, we were attempting to understand what does it take to scale a program like this. And we did not limit the enrollments to customers on TOU. And of course, we were still focusing on the incremental value of DR over the daily TOU savings, but also a heavy focus on let's just see what it takes to get as many enrollments as we can. And with those two studies, we said, where do we want to go with this? For the 2024 to 2027 filing, we proposed the Automated Response Technology Program, but not just to focus on smart thermostats. The idea here was, yes, we'll migrate over the population of smart thermostats, of which we had achieved 110,000 smart thermostats under about 90,000 customers. Yes, migrate those over as the first step in launching ART, but also how can we get other DER technologies onto the program? And what does it take to have them all under one tariff and focus also still on TOU? It's the right thing to do to push for those daily automated savings, leveraging technology. Only this is not behavioral in any way, just leveraging technologies to achieve load control, to achieve load reductions. So let's go to next. And this is just building on that a bit more. And Josh and team have also shared here some of the measurement and evaluation approaches. Gold standard of RCT for both the DRET study and the pilot. And you can see here the number of participants and number of devices, number of events, and some of our learning objectives here. So just bumping those out a bit further here. I'll focus on 2022 and the systemic testing. We, Josh and team had created a pretty complex operations plan in order for us to test various permutations of duration, temperatures, time of day, just so we could really understand what we were looking at and prepare us for market integration. Yes, it was very important to us as soon as possible to get these smart thermostats into the CAISO market. And we were grateful the CPUC was open to that idea and granted us permission to do so for 2023. So 2022 was a prep year. 2023, it was just focused on the bidding, the operations of that, and what do awards look like. And we, of course, didn't, in 2023 was a very different weather year. We're going to talk about that a bit more than 2022. And we did not dispatch all of the resources at once. It was really based on all market awards. So, and here we come with ART. And ART is a pay for performance program where we're going to be paying third parties for actual performance. There aren't capacity payments, there aren't penalties. It's just actually the following month pay for performance. So, and we're not going to be using device telemetry. This is all based on meter data. And let's see, other highlights. I've mentioned all those. And yes, ART will also be market integrated. It'll be a PDR, proxy demand resource. Next. Let's talk a little bit about the technologies that are already going to be transitioned. We're working to transition these currently. And I should pause for a moment to mention that, that we did receive, our ART is an approved program. It was authorized in D21-1205, and as such, actually that's D23-12005, sorry about that. And but it was contingent upon a tier 3 advice letter before we could actually begin operations. The CPUC did give us, authorize us $1.6 million so that we could transition the smart thermostat population to ensure they stayed enrolled under PG&E's program. And so we're building out systems and, getting everything ready for that. So when the program rolled out, the first technology was ecobee thermostats. They were the first that were ready to go, quickly followed by Nest. And we had Emerson even the first year. Honeywell just joined in 2023. And you can see, lots of the differences here for how customers found out about the program, or what was the primary channel for promoting, and which ones actually have TOU response ability. And ecobee is who we'll be focusing on the most because they have the most robust capability in this realm. Emerson also, one of the differences here is that the ecobee platform provides for the daily TOU response. For Emerson, it was controlled out of our partner's head-end system, their platform. Our partner on the program has been Uplight, and they have a system called Orchestrated Energy. So OE, as we refer to it, is capable of dispatching smart thermostats for daily TOU as well. Honeywell isn't quite there yet. We'll explore that further. Just to let you know that under ART, if a customer is on a TOU rate, they must, and the provider must, support daily automatic load shifting. So it's a customer can opt out of that, but it is required as the default. Let's see, other highlights here. You can see set pre-cooling strategies for some of them. ecobee is a very dynamic programming. It's based on customer preferences, and you'll see the results of that here. Let's see, I think that's it for all the highlights here. Next. These are some graphic depictions of event durations on the right-hand side. You can see how, the population size is determined by, displayed by the size of the dot. So you can see our larger events. And this is for 2022. Let's go ahead and take a look at the table on the left. And you can see some intense, this was 2022. Let's all remember what was going on in early September. Leading up to early September, though, we did have some events. You can see the variation under DR5 max temperature and participant temperature. You can see the variation in the temperatures. And you can see, 716, we got up to 100. But then let's look at what's happening towards the end of August. And there we go, getting into September. You can see the extreme weather that came ahead. We do call that a 1 in 30 weather event. And you can see corresponding CAISO peaks. Of course, we did have historic peaks and the associated PG&E demand. And what's also very interesting to track here are market prices. So for the coincidence of market prices and our dispatches, you can see that oftentimes we're dispatching when prices are in the 100 to, mid 100s to 200s generally, but then we had quite a bump for those extreme temperatures. And, a lot of times when we're actually looking at prices at T-2, 2 days before our dispatch events, we're looking at negative prices. We're basing our bidding for the most part on temperature, and our circumstances ripe for that. And so what we see is in the real-time market, those prices do shoot up. So the coincidence of temperature and price definitely plays out in the post-event results. Next. So as I mentioned, yes, 2023, we focused on integrating into the CAISO market. So you've got some nice demonstrations of sublaps. Oftentimes in a day, we do dispatch multiple sublaps in a day based on temperatures in those sublaps. PG&E, as you know, has an extremely diverse territory with many different microclimates. So we definitely have to set temperature thresholds based on each of the sublaps. They're unique to that sublap based on historical temperatures. So, and we often had rapid turnaround of evaluation. Because this was a pilot, we asked DSA to give us as quick as possible results so that we could, take a look at our operational plan, make any modifications, and inform our leaders of what the potential of this program was. Here we were about to file for, or we actually already had May 1st, yes, filed for 24 to 27, but what would implementing a program like this look like? And so the pilot again informed some of the operations and implementation to come. And to note was that, of course, 2023 was a much more mild summer. And there weren't any CAISO emergencies, and PG&E also did not have any system-wide emergencies. In fact, in 2023, we didn't have any emergencies. Yeah, and that feeds right into the fact that 2022 was such an extreme year. And you can see the historical analysis on the right there, and just more of what we all know. And the comparison then of 2023, temperatures were quite a bit lower throughout the whole day. So, all right, next slide. I believe we, Nest definitely has the largest market share of smart thermostats throughout our territory. And for this pilot, we were able to enroll a great deal of Nest thermostats. So but the thing is that are still plenty of Nest smart thermostats out there. The question always is where are they? And are they worth having in the program from a perspective of, are we going to be able to, have a good load reduction out of them? Are they in those hotter areas? And you're going to see a bit of that evidence coming up. So, and yes, here we go. You can see where the thermostats are throughout our territory. And you can see all of the blue. Well, those are the coastal areas, often a little bit cooler. The red, of course, is in the inland areas, and those are our prime markets, right? And you can see penetration rates here. And a few customer insights there, that 1/3 of the customers had solar. We took a look at who of our participants are on CARE. We did coordinate with with our ESA program, our Energy Savings Assistance Program, and marketing our program to those customers who had received free thermostats through the ESA program. So that was a real target of ours. And something that I'm not always happy with, but what do we do about it is some customers have multiple smart thermostats at one site at their homes. Why am I not happy about that? Josh may go into details on that, but generally we don't get double the load reduction for the multiple thermostats per site. And a high rate of the ecobee thermostats did enable the daily automated shifting. So that was very good. All right, next.
And it switches over to me.
Pass it to you, Josh.
Thanks, Wendy. A quick note on the right-hand side plot. That's actually an analysis of all 5 million PG&E AMI data where we actually estimate AC load for all their customers. And we depicted it by zip code, but to me, it's quite fascinating when you start looking under the hood that there's a ton of folks who have thermostats but are in relatively cool areas that are basically watching out for the handful of days they might get every other year to basically have cooling in their home. So it really opens up a question as to whether or not those particular locations are worth going after and cost effective to go after. And that's always been one of the biggest challenges overall, because most of the vendors, the OEMs to be more precise, prefer to market to everybody and charge the same fee for everybody, irrespective of where it happens, which is part of the logic to shifting to a pay-for-performance program. Let's talk about methodology, the really exciting stuff, right? But this is a quick summary, a lot of words. I want to cut to the chase. In both years, we looked at the full population of data, right? So every single site was analyzed. I should probably say 99% of the population, because there's always a handful of sites that have messy data or need to be screened out. We did analyze the results two ways. One is using end-use data, the other one AMI data. But from the beginning, based on the valuation plan, the results were going to be based. The primary results were going to be based on the AMI data. The operations, as Wendy noted, were different in 2022. They were really focused. We were really focused on introducing a lot of variation in weather. So we went to cold weather, and they're both like, not cold, but medium hot events and really extreme events in order to really define that weather relationship and really have the variation, start times, durations, weekday versus weekend. That was done on purpose. We called lots of events, but didn't call every single customer lots of times. And that was done by essentially randomly assigning customers to 10 different groups. And for each event, we would withhold a control group, except for system emergencies. And typically, we often dispatch 2 groups and withheld the other 8, or 1 group and withheld the other 9. That way, you could do a lot of testing systematically over and over to really define that relationship and really understand it without exhausting your customers. The analysis that we did for the 22 was based on a difference in difference panel regression. Really straightforward, specific with the randomized controlled trial. It just gave it an extra added amount of precision for the results. For 2023, we actually were very much focused on, within a couple-day turnaround of impacts. So we kind of had to change the methodology. We couldn't do the full random assignment at the point. So we really still analyzed it using the AMI data. And we had all this variation that was happening because any KISO dispatch, except for the test event where we called everybody at once, but all the KISO dispatch were calling like different locations at different points in time for different hours. So in this particular case, we basically just relied on a match control group. We had a nice tournament to pick the best match control group. And really rely on that, what we refer to as a classic difference in difference calculation. Simple enough that you can explain it to people and say, here's the calculation by hand, if they want to do it by hand. But because the control group was really good and you had a difference in difference correction, the results kind of held up. And that was done by design to turn around the analysis, within a couple of days after receiving the AMI data. And that was all the AMI data processing was automated. Big thanks to the PG&E team, because they actually worked with us to make sure we could get data within a couple of days after each event. This is an example of the randomized control trial. This is raw data, no modeling whatsoever, just to kind of illustrate this. I forget what data it is. I think what says 9.4. There it is. But essentially, those large sample sizes effectively eliminate baseline error. The baseline is just given by here's the behavior of the customers who were not dispatched, and due to random assignment, they're a proper representation of what would happen. And as you get to smaller and smaller results, which happens for some sublabs, you get a bit more noise overall, which is why we still stuck to the difference in differences modeling. But this is pretty classic. We kind of had 8 groups being held back as control groups in this day, 2 being dispatched, and you can just clearly see the effects in terms of the results. This is a high level view as to what we did in 2023. I'm not going to walk through all this. I think I discussed this through. It's just a good way to represent the approach. But the punchline is difference in difference with the match control group with a tournament, mostly focused on getting really good matches. And here's an example of what we get when we apply that, the difference in difference calculation, whether you do it through panel regression or through the simple approach. before the intervention, or basically your non-event hot days, you want to see the control and the treatment load effectively look nearly identical. There's small differences that happens either because of sampling noise or because the matches are not always perfect. When you see the intervention in place, or the event day, you should see a nice clean drop in the load during the hours where you have the dispatch, and you see that very clearly. You can see like here treatment control. This is just raw data, and here's the delta that you have there, and you see a bit of pre-cooling and a bit of snapback in there as well. And ultimately, the difference calculation, simply saying we're going to net out pre-existing differences, right, out of the noise, and make an adjustment for that. And you see the final result at the tail end with confidence bands. So really clean set of impacts, really simple, straightforward analysis to comprehend, and lots of events and variation. And we'll dive into those right now. This is the impacts on 9/8. It's one of the hottest days. I think 9/8 and 9/7 were two of the hotter days. And the main point to highlight here is that you are getting, impacts that are relatively large for the first hour, typically over kW, but they decay for hours 2, 3, 4, right? Because you had like lots of 4-hour events, and you can see that decay happening for the longer events. And that's actually pretty classic when you start looking at load impacts that come out of thermostats. They often give you a bigger response in hour 1, lower impacts in hour 2, 3, 4. And it's always been a challenge to kind of integrate those into the CAISO events, because it doesn't really factor that into the CAISO bid patterns overall. But it's a clean look at this. Here's a look at all the events that happened in 2022. Just for reference, to normalize this, we kind of standardized this so we could have event hour 1, 2, 3 impacts, even though the actual event hours are different. Because in practice, the hours into the event for this particular program were actually a bigger factor than weather in terms of determining the impacts. And this is something you see for a lot of thermostat-based programs overall. And it was useful, though, because it kind of allows us to understand the variability that happens alongside weather, as well as understand, here's the impacts of the first hour versus the second hour overall.
Josh,
and of course, yep.
I wanted to add more, but finish your thought.
Sure. And of course, you can see to the left, here's all of the sites that were dispatched. They're growing over time, over the course of 2022. But they're essentially, factor in the randomized control trial, which is, even when you see few sites being dispatched, you have a pretty robust evaluation. Go ahead, Wendy.
I just want to highlight the hour over hour load reduction values here. And as compared to an AC switch, AC switches using cycling strategies that use algorithms can provide sustained release over multiple hours. However, smart thermostats use mostly a temperature ramping strategy, where they're going to pre-cool, then they're going to go for the most temperature increase in the home in that first hour, and then they're going to step that down. And that is because they're always trying to balance customer comfort with the sales of their product and promoting the sales of their product. They don't want unhappy customers, and these thermostats don't really use cycling strategies, which from my perspective would be preferable.
Yeah. Just adding to that a little bit is that if you look at switches, the impacts will change, but that's mostly due to the fact that the AC load is changing. Here you get a double hit, right? The AC load might be going down during the hours of the event. And in addition to that, the percentage impacts might be shifting because of the fact that you're effectively using the building thermal mass as a storage device. So you're essentially saying, I have X amount of time before I hit my set point in my thermostat again, and it gets triggered, or customers opt out, one of the two. But this is a pretty standard approach. Thermostats can do cycling, and actually, I believe Edison did a few tests a couple of years ago where they explicitly were testing cycling strategies versus a thermostat set points.
Yeah,
and that's something that can be enabled, but it's a bit of a tricky part, because you don't want to use the a deeper thermostat cycling approach every single time. There are programs in different parts of the country, Duke specifically, where they'll call like, here's what you do in your normal day. If you have an emergency day, we actually do 75% cycling. But ideal might be to combine the two over time.
Yeah, the Honeywell thermostat is capable of that. We used to do that with our direct install thermostats as well.
Yep. Moving forward, what do we get out of this? Well, we have all this variability that we have in this case, we called, because we called a random sample set of customers. This is representative of all the customers in the territory. We don't have, a whole bunch of variability that some customers in hotter areas, some customers in colder areas got cold this year. So it gives you a really clean picture as to the impacts in the relationship with weather. And we had lots of events in 2022. And you can see very clearly, here's the pattern, right? You can see like the first hour events follow weather trend, the second hour events follow weather trend, the third hour and the fourth hour follow a different trend overall. Pretty clean to look at the variability and to say, here's the pattern. And it starts forming the basis for some of the modeling that happens as to what you would get under planning conditions. So it's a bit messier in 2023, and not because the impacts are off, but it's really just the fact you have all this locational dispatch, different zones are being called, often hotter zones versus colder zones. So you have to account for all the variability in the customer mix being dispatched in 2023. But I like this view because it's so clean in general. We did a whole bunch of analysis for different customer segments. I'm not going to go through this. They go by device brand, geographic area, low income, thermostat, solar. The main punchline for this is that customers, the location where you're at matters. If you're in a hot, warmer area, you get pretty big impacts. There's parts of the service territory where you get small impacts, and you likely don't want to encourage vendors to kind of go in that direction, even though they will push in that area. But it gives you a really kind of look at the variability overall. And folks can look through this in the slide deck if they wish to. 2023 load impacts. I mentioned that the 2023 load impacts were really done almost within a day or two after each event. And they relied on the match control group approach and simple differences. We saw pretty clean impacts. This is probably showing one of the days where most of the locations were dispatched. As we mentioned, not every single location was dispatched except for the single test event that we ran. And the test event was primarily to actually test out the ability to do locational dispatch. It was an operational test, not a load impact test on purpose, called really early in the summer. But ultimately, you get the impacts and the results for them. You just have to be a bit more cautious in the interpretation because you have a lot of variability in sites, but those sites are distributed differently for different days because the CAISO dispatches, dispatching here's the sublab in Fresno and a few other sublabs, and not dispatching coastal sublabs or vice versa. So looking at the average impacts is just a little bit more challenging for 2023, and kind of going through that. You really have to look at it on a sublab by sublab basis, and you really have to understand, which areas were dispatched versus not. Otherwise you get vendors claiming that they got massive impacts when in fact it's just the fact that most of the events were dispatched in the hotter areas of the territory. And the temperature and the geographic area, obviously determines a lot of the impacts overall. This kind of clustering things by geographic area, really broad areas that are more understandable than the 16 sublabs. But in general, you see like trends that happen. Like there's areas that are much hotter, areas that are much cooler, and you just have different locations that where you have impacts that differ quite a bit. Almost none of the impacts in the Bay Area coastal, which you separate based on the anything, there's the East Bay Hills. When you start moving to the right, that gets actually relatively warm really fast. But anything to the west of that, we're kind of calling the coastal area. The temperatures barely cracked 90. A lot of those events were like 80 when they're being dispatched, or 70 degrees when you're being dispatched. And in general, you don't want to use AC load control when temperatures are below 85 degrees. You get very little AC load, and you get a lot of noise in the estimation. So I'll just point that out. These are per site performance by sublab. This is kind of averaging across all the events that were called. by sublap. So you see a lot of a better sense of the variability that you have by sublap overall. Now, obviously, different events were called for a different day, but this is a preferable view to just understand the variability overall. And again, we sliced this by hour of the event, given that we had a lot of variability in the event start times. Let's talk about ex ante results. Just a quick time sheet. We're at 9:40, so we're going to have plenty of time for questions. So by design, ex ante impacts reflect the magnitude of the resources available under planning conditions. So the goal there is to take the historical data, adjust it for weather conditions in particular, right? But there's other variation that you have. You know, when you look at the historical actual events that were dispatched, we saw the variability in temperature. We saw variability in what share of the resources were being dispatched. We saw variability in terms of the event start times and the length of the dispatch. And you had a whole bunch of changes happening in the participant mix. So in order to standardize this and get to the ultimate question, which is what is the magnitude of resources available under planning conditions overall, then you need to standardize for weather. You need to look and say, well, what happens if we do full dispatch of the resources available? And you need to standardize for the event hours and the length of the dispatch. And last, you know, if there's program changes, you can factor those in. Those can be a bit more challenging, but also you're incorporating the PG&E projected enrollments. So there's a plan for this. We say, here's the per customer or per device impact. And then you basically going to apply and say, here's the forecasted enrollment and what's the magnitude of resources that you expect to get. Obviously, we produce the ex ante impacts for different conditions. They're defined either by PG&E or CAISO-wide weather conditions. They're defined for what is a normal peak year, a 1 in 2, or an extreme year, a 1 in 2, 1 in 10. They're also produced on an hourly basis by month. So the beauty of the protocols, which are drafted back in 2008, is that they align pretty perfectly, actually, with the slice of day methodology that's being adopted for resource adequacy, which requires here's the impacts by hour and by month on the worst day of each month. So that's sort of the process. Even though the program is shifting to ART, right, which is going to accept a lot more technologies, at least in the initial time frame, the bulk of the impacts are going to be coming from these thermostats that transition to that program. So the impacts were grounded on the pilot that was in the thermostat pilot that was implemented in 2022 and 2023. And we actually used the 2023 data, 2021 data as well, because they're really the similar mix of customers. This summarizes what was done. At a high level, the only point I have is we just analyzed the data by sublab, by temperature condition and all the components, and basically the predictive model, right, which helps you predict the impacts under different types of conditions, different weather, different start times, different event durations, really explain 91% of the historical variation in data. And we had lots and lots of events to pick from. I think 2021 had about, even though it was only in place for half a summer, we had about 14 events, 2022, 19 events. And I'm going off the top of my head, 2023, I believe, was 10 events. So you kind of had a lot of data regarding actual performance under different types of conditions, some of it introduced on purpose. But even though it varied a lot, right, a lot of it was very easy to explain, very predictable overall. This is a look at individual sublabs. You can ignore the line because that's a nonlinear function that we fit in here. But ultimately, when you look at it, you have a very clear weather trend. Some variation you see is just different start times and end times. Once you start accounting for that, you can get to it pretty directly. There were sublabs where you saw almost nothing, right? Like Humboldt, you have almost no data there. San Francisco, where surprisingly some people actually have AC and thermostats, but most of the areas where you had actual weather variability, you had very clear effects taking place overall. And ultimately, the data, from all this predictive model is being used to develop, here's the impacts under planning conditions. So here's a peek at the 1 and 2 June monthly peak day, which is the hottest day in the PG&E weather overall in terms of the historical weather patterns that are being used for 1 and 2. And you get impacts that are well within the range, actually quite a bit below the 2022 and 2023 impacts, quite a bit below 2022, right around the same range as 2023, which is to be expected, because 2022 was such an extreme year. So we have relatively well-defined impacts and they're relatively extreme conditions overall. And this is a preview of the enrollment forecast. It's a device level. We have you have to look at this from two perspectives. One is customers, the other one is devices. But essentially the forecast is expected to grow over time and then level out. I think PG&E does have plans to incorporate other technologies into this beyond thermostats, ranging from EVs to other items such as battery storage, but the whole process of integrating and incorporating these additional devices into the program is going to take a bit of time. But the whole thought of it is to make a one-stop shop where you enroll the customer, you don't enroll the end-use device. In an aggregate, this translates into roughly, 43 megawatts for 2024, 70 megawatts, by the time the program is expected to stabilize. So just to wrap up, key things that we found. I didn't dive very heavily into the daily automated shifting because the focus here is on impacts over and above daily automated shifting. So all the results I presented were impacts above, over, and daily automated shifting. If folks want to talk about daily automated shifting, I have lots of presentations on that. We actually gave one at PLMA a couple last week. So it covers that pretty directly. But the punchline for this is that thermostats, as we all know, are very highly sensitive to weather. They vary a lot by geographic region. The catch with them is that demand reduction is actually bigger when temperatures are hottest, which is typically when the grid needs the resources the most. The thermostats can do two things, or it can reduce demand on a daily basis over and above daily automation and over and above behavioral response to TOU rates. And they're really delivering incremental demand reduction on event days. Now, there's a catch here. If you do daily automation with a thermostat, you cannibalize a little bit of the dispatchable demand reduction. And that portion basically is in no man's land because it's not efficiency, it's not DR, it's not actual customer behavior, it's technology enabled daily response. It doesn't have a regulatory home, it doesn't have a funding home, to be very blunt about it. But it can do both, all right, pretty easily. The demand reductions do decay across the event hours. So if you're bringing in all these thermostats into the portfolio, you need to firm them up. There'll probably be some testing as to how to firm this, how to combine it with other resources so that you can provide more controllable, I would put it, load impacts, where you can say, here's the amount of megawatts you want by hour, rather than just having, here's the big drop in the first hour, big impacts in the first hour and the drop in the second hour. The intentional testing was actually very critical here because all that testing that was done in 2022, in particular, it enabled the development of very useful predictive models that explain the bulk of the variation in load impacts. And that was done on purpose. The whole concept of use 10 randomly assigned groups, you call lots and lots of events, but actually define how you're going to vary it before the summer, right? It can happen. And you typically don't get that information by calling impacts in events in response to California ISO events alone. It would take about 5 years to do what we did in 2022 if you just relied on CAISO events and the variation that you get introduced based on when they call it and how they call it. The ex-ante impacts were just well within the ranges observed in 22 and 2023, actually lower than 2022. And obviously this program is shifting to pay for performance structure, and that will probably have the biggest impact because the whole goal of that is to get folks, the vendors, to start shifting away from cooler regions and really focus their resources on the hotter areas where you get the bigger bang per buck. So with that, we can wrap this up and take questions.
I did want to add that the ART Tier 3 advice letter is not yet approved, and it's looking like perhaps not until later in the season, July, August timeframe. So June megawatts, which I believe we have represented in our modeling, are not available. So we're anxiously awaiting the approval of that advice letter. Any questions?
Andrew?
Thank you for this great presentation. Earlier, you had mentioned that September 2022 was a 1 in 30 year kind of weather event. What kind of weather event was 2023? Was that about our average 1
It's
in
about a
2,
1 in,
or was it even more mild?
it's actually about a 1 in 2, a little bit above that actually. So you can look at, here's the weather data, and we looked at this based on, this is a little different view. PG&E uses for operations purposes the average of the Sacramento, San Jose, Concord, Fresno, and Red Bluff stations. They call that DR5. So we pulled the data for since 1990, right, to take a look at all the historical peaks, because it's pretty extreme. And each of these, on the right-hand side, each of these dots represents, here's the max temperature, which is really the average of those 5 stations for each of the years, right? And you can tell 2022 is off the charts compared to everything else, and 2023 is actually relatively warm, but most of the summer was cool. There was a handful of hotter events, but overall, right? And you can see the plots, they're called as the spaghetti plot, but it's really plotting the hourly temperature for each of the hottest days in the past, since 1990 going forward. And we intentionally highlighted 2022 and 2023. So 23 is probably a little bit above a 1 in 2, whereas 2022 is really definitely higher than a 1 in 10. And I think that the key distinction that we tend to see this, and it's something that's probably worth emphasizing, is that 1 in 2 conditions, there's PG&E specific, and then there's like system wide for CAISO, but they can happen when, say, Northern California is really hot and Southern California is relatively cool. And that actually happened in 2023. There are lots of events. I live in Southern California. I used to live in Northern California, being cold and high grid prices. And I'm like, well, why are they calling the events? It's not even hot outside, right? Partly because where I lived, right, it wasn't warm. But really 1 in 10 or extreme conditions really happen when both the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state are really warm overall at the same time.
Great, thank you. Another question I had was more just, and maybe because I'm less familiar with all of the regression models, but could you really explain maybe the difference between the panel regression with difference in difference you did for 2022 ex post and the classic difference in difference for 2023, and how that might affect the modeling results? Although I will say the 91% is quite impressive.
Well, and that's for the second stage model. That's kind of explaining here's the variability and impacts, right? The difference to me is actually rather simple, right? It's probably best illustrated in this graph, right? They're both doing the same thing, right? That one is doing it through regression, right? And we can walk through the math, but the concept is the same. You're going to use, in this case, hot event and hot non-event or proxy weather, and here's event days. And you're going to have a ability to control and to say, here's the impact that you have of the date, right? It really is an event versus non-event, right? Independent, right, of who gets cold. They're both experiencing that. Then you're also going to look and say, well, what's the difference that you have between treatment and control? And in the process, you're netting out or controlling for the pre-existing differences, right? So the classic difference in difference is actually estimated straightforward through what are basically paired t-test and then a combination at the tail end. It's probably the cleanest technique. I can literally drop the results in a table, show them to you, and you'll understand the calculation, where you can see it very clearly. The panel regression is doing the same thing. Except that you can introduce additional explanatory variables. So if your model, if you have a really clean match, you can just go straight for the simplest calculation, which is our preference. If it's really clean, keep it simple, right? If you go to the panel regression, if say your match control isn't that good, you can introduce additional explanatory variables like weather, other factors, to be able to account for some of the differences. In this particular case, right, because we had a big match control pool and we focused on getting as good as a match control group as possible, it was really straightforward to run the analysis using a classic difference in difference approach, and also just a lot faster. So if I'm trying to cycle through all these different slices by hour, by event, it just runs a lot faster and gets implemented. And part of the reason we elected that is because we knew in 2023 we were going to try to give results within a couple days after each event. And because we knew it would be implemented and scale really quickly overall. And we had focused very heavily on basically not trying to specify a regression model, but really find a really good match control group.
Great, thanks, Josh. I see David Oliver has a question, so I'll pass it over to him.
Yeah, can we go to the growth chart? We're leveled off.
At this one right here, the enrollment or the
Yeah.
megawatts, they're both the same.
The enrollment, it's fine.
Yeah.
I just want to be sure because I missed it. Is this so this is enrollment of accounts, right?
Yeah, it's enrollment of accounts. There may have been, go ahead.
But is it based on art, the number of art accounts? So it could be an EV only account, or it could be a other technology account. Okay.
I think until they incorporate the other technology accounts, they kind of assume that people would have a thermostat right in there. So it's probably a conservative assumption in the sense that it's factoring in really the thermostat impacts overall.
Okay.
But you're right, people could enroll with multiple technologies or with one technology.
And the idea is that
mm-hmm.
And the idea is that if they say they have a thermostat and an EV, for example,
correct,
it's going to be up to the third party or whatever to kind of just determine how to reduce the household, if you will, megawatts or kilowatts, excuse me. And PG&E is kind of agnostic as to whether they do it with the EV or with the air conditioning. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct, right? It's kind of like saying, like, really you're enrolling it's more from a customer experience as well perspective, right? Because you don't want a customer to have to enroll one or two or three programs or pick between them. You just want to have a one-stop shop where I say I want to enroll in DR. I have a bunch of connected devices in my home. I get to enroll them all at once, and that's the logic behind it, is to really kind of focus on the customer experience, and also to just incentivize the vendors of connected devices to kind of deliver bigger impacts, which is why there's a pay for performance component overall.
And I like the way you said that, and that we are technology agnostic. We're measuring at the meter, so.
I think Abby had a question.
No, I was just trying. I was going to say the same thing that Josh and Wendy just tried to explain. Yeah, it's customers will be counted by service account, not by device. Yeah.
Great. We'll go back to Andrew then.
Great, thanks. Can we go back one slide? Looking at the ex-ante impacts, you are even showing in the last hour of an event that you've modeled a negative load impact. So are we really seeing that after 4 hours, even a 5-hour event, it doesn't matter if the event is technically still occurring, there's going to be negative load impact?
No, it's basically constraint. A lot of the OEMs, basically the Nest and Ecobee of the world, not all of them, but they basically they won't allow events to go more than 4 hours. So even if we tried to negotiate this and have a discussion, because actually in 2022 I wanted to test lots of 5-hour events. So the initial operations plan had a number of 5-hour events, and we ran it up and to say, hey, can we implement this for testing purposes? And the answer back is no, that's not feasible, because we won't allow that control to last longer than 4 hours. And again, it's like they own part of that relationship with their customer, and they don't want to they want to keep their customers happy. That's the way to put it. So really the reflection here is it's a 4-hour event, and we're just showing the snapback. But we highlighted the 4-9 window.
I see. Okay, so even though there were 5-hour events called, the constraint that's placed on the device by the device manufacturer meant that it was a 4-hour event in practice anyway.
We didn't call 5-hour events, to be blunt. So if you look at the events that were called, so I'm going to scoot back a little bit, and apologies if it goes back and forth. The longest events called were 4 hours. We tried to schedule or plan for 5-hour events, and we got pushed back, essentially. So we never called 5-hour events. We did attempt to negotiate that unsuccessfully. All the events were 4 hours.
Okay.
At most.
Okay.
But it's not really a design option. It's kind of like you can design it on paper, but you can't really call it in practice. Or if you do, you have to do it by staggering the customers that you call. So you could deliver an 8-hour event or a 6-hour event, but you can't do a 6-hour event for 100% of the resources. You have to stagger resources.
Understood. I think that's my last question. Thank you.
Great. I actually had one question before we finish. I think you talked about there was a section of customers who weren't defined under any regulatory base. Could you just dive into that a little bit?
That's a separate discussion. So one of the things that we tested in here, Wendy, are you okay if I shared a PLMA presentation? It's public.
Sure.
Anyhow,
Yes.
let me dig it up because I don't know if I have it on my desktop, but let me pull it up. But one of the things that was being done as part of this pilot, right? I focused on the incremental impacts, but we're also testing, can you enable daily TOU automation? And in doing so, give me a second. In doing so, we were running basically the ability to say, can we use the thermostats to deliver demand reductions each and every single day during TOU hours? This is a presentation. It's public. It was presented last week at PLMA. Let me just share my screen again. I showed my whole screen. But the punchline for this is very simple. It's when you enable daily TOU automation, this is end-use data. Remember how we said that 59% of Ecobee devices opted to do daily TOU automation? This is effectively automation that is enabled by the thermostat and the vendor. So you have to work with them to do it. So all these customers were already on TOU rates. They're already giving you their behavioral response. If they were going to modify their thermostat, they had already done that. And then on top of that, we came over and Ecobee really kind of came through and said, okay, well, as part of the enrollment process, do you want to enroll? It was in-app enrollment. Do you want to enroll in this program? Do you want us to automate your response to daily response to TOU rates? Customers said yes, pick the rate, and they could sit there and say, well, what's your trade-off between comfort and savings that you want to have? They elected that as well. But for the 59% of Ecobee devices that said, hey, I want to enable daily TOU automation, you had this happening on a daily basis. Every single day, you would have a difference in terms of and this is raw data, this is end-use data, so it's runtime data coming directly from the thermostat. It's easier to see in the end-use data. You can see it on the actual on the actual AMI data as well, but it's just cleaner in the end-use data. But you can see here's daily shifting happen every single day. And it's occurring, in most days, the AC load isn't that high, but you can see it happening every single day, just taking place. And if I go look at it from the perspective of here's every single 4 to 9 window of the week, you can see like in the middle of the summer, you get a lot of reductions happening overall as a whole. And there's a heat map somewhere in here. You guys can look at this presentation showing here's the 8760 impacts for every single hour. But all that is to technology-enabled daily TOU automation. So it doesn't fit under TOU because the analysis of TOU rates happens when the customers transition to TOU. This technology enablement happened about 3-4 years afterwards. They had transitioned to TOU rates. It doesn't fit in DR because it's there every single day. It's basically event-based. It doesn't fit in energy efficiency, right? So there is this space, and this actually applies to batteries and thermostats and heat pump water heaters as well, and other technologies, probably EV loads as well, where you can enable or essentially be a technology and say, I'm going to basically give you the ability to do daily shifting that the customers don't do on their own. But there is no home for it from a regulatory standpoint or from a funding standpoint at this stage. So effectively, if PG&E is doing daily TOU automation, they're getting smaller event day impacts overall by doing so. So when we look at the results, let me see, do I have this? Sorry, I'm climbing through this presentation a little bit quickly here. But when we look at the overall results, right, this is what it looks like without automation versus with automation. They're both Ecobee customers that did and did not elect. They're matched. But you can see here's the daily shifting at different temperatures. And when you look at event days, you end up having like a notch in the Ecobee devices that have opted for daily shifting versus the ones who have not opted for daily shifting. So you just get lower, incremental event-based response, even though the response is just split into two parts. One is daily load shaping, the other one is an event day boost. Does that help answer your question?
Yes,
I know I went
yes,
into a
it
lot of
does.
detail. Yeah.
No, that was perfect. Thank you.
But it's a bit of a gray area, right? And I think like people have been asking that question, actually in battery side quite a lot more too, but it's going to apply to batteries, it's going to apply to EVs. It applies to thermostats, anything where you can essentially automate your daily shifting, but it's not something a customer would do on their own.
Yeah, no, definitely interesting to think about. Did anyone else have any questions? Great. Okay, I think we can move on to the next present. Oh, no, someone's got a present question. Aisha?
Hi, yes, I just had a quick question about the move of Honeywell to allow for operation of daily TOU as well as Nest. So I'm seeing that both of those don't have the daily TOU response. Mm-hmm. Are they moving in that direction?
We believe Honeywell is capable. Nest, okay. And so we'll be exploring that. We brought them in towards the latter part of last season, and so we weren't able to explore all of the capabilities. Nest is an interesting situation. They launched Nest Renew, and under that, a customer is able to do some type of TOU, but as Josh will tell you, we couldn't see it in meter data, and Nest was unwilling to share with us who of their customers had elected that particular functionality.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think it was a bit tricky because 2022 and 23, they were running pilots. It wasn't clear which customers were enrolled, whether it's part of them, all of them. We just knew we couldn't see it in the end-use data. And the end-use data, you see it very clearly because you actually see the thermostat temperature changes, as well as like the just purely the AC load without any of the whole home noise overall. So you didn't see it on there. And based on the handful of conversations I had with them, it seems like the Nest Renew is really focused in response to CO2 emissions, not to TOU rates or prices or peak periods. And which I'll let them explain themselves. But what main point I want to point out is every thermostat has the capability to do that. They can do daily TOU automation. They can do event response. It's just a question of how you manage the setback strategies and how you implement them. So they just have not enabled that directly.
And I'm recalling, I don't remember what slide it was, but you were saying that the market was dominated by Nest, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to kind of see how things are going to progress, just to kind of get an idea. Okay. And so the Renew is an actual new device, or is it some sort of software update that will occur with their Nest devices that currently are installed?
No, it's just an algorithm. It's basically people.
Okay, it's an algorithm. Okay.
It's an algorithm. People opt into it, right? Say just like Ecobee did it, right? You could get an push notice and you say, I want to enable this or don't want to enable it, and people get that choice. So it's an algorithm, but it's an algorithm that seems to be geared towards CO2 emissions, not towards prices or peak shifting.
But would there be expected overlap between those strategies, I would assume, to some degree?
You need visibility. I mean, like if you don't have visibility, if you don't have visibility as to which customers are opting, if you don't see in the load shapes, it doesn't exist, right?
Got it.
So you need some visibility there.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any further questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, Wendy and Josh. I think we can move on to SDG&E's non-residential ELRP presentation now.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Alana Lamarchand, a partner also at DSA. Hopefully you can all hear me. And I would also happily go on camera. I don't know if I need to be made the presenter to do that. Let me just see if it can turn on. And can everybody see me, hear me?
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
Excellent. Okay, great. So yeah, I'll just go ahead and share the slide. So I'll be presenting on SDG&E's ELRP evaluation for program year 2023. And okay, I'll go right into it. Everybody can see my screen, I'm assuming. Great. All right, so yeah, so I'll just cover, an overview of the program. We'll kind of go through the ex post methodology, the ex post results, and then we'll touch on the enrollment forecast and ex ante methodology and results. And I will say that this year we also evaluated the ELRP program for the other two IOUs. And so all of these, the methodologies are consistent across IOUs. So in terms of the program, so in SDG&E territory, the emergency load reduction program has about 7 different subgroups that are active. So there's A1, which is non-residential customers, A2, non-residential aggregators, A3, which is Rule 21 exporting DERs, A4, which is virtual power plants, essentially battery storage. There's a A5 vehicle to grid integration aggregators. A6 is the residential customer behavioral program, and then there's B2, which is for IOU CDP programs. And I'll say that this presentation is going to focus on A1, A4, and B2 and 86 on the ex ante side. There were no events this year, exposed events for residential. For the other 3 groups, we won't be covering this because they have a small participation count, and so those have been redacted from not only this presentation but also the the public reporting. And at a high level, this is really the ELRP. It was rolled out in 2021. And the goal of this program is really to expand the state's portfolio of emergency resources beyond those kind of CAISO capacity markets, kind of in response to the emergency conditions that we all experienced in 2020. And at least in 2023, the incentive structure for ELRP was a performance incentive based on baseline settlements at $2 per kWh with no penalties. And just at a very high level here, you can see that A1, there's a few hundred sites, and there were no significant load reductions in 2023, and I'll get into that a little bit later. In terms of A4, the virtual power plant, that was just rolled out in September, and there are just over 300 sites, and saw very, very clear reductions there. Again, there were no impacts for the residential A6 behavioral program and for B2. We did see significant impacts, at least on some of the event days. And just a bird's eye view of what those event days were. For all groups except for A4 and A6, there were 3 events called towards the end of July, all in the evening. And a few interesting things about those events. First of all, the notice that was received was not only date of notice, but for the most part, at least the first two events, it was actually 1 hour and less than 1 hour advance notice. So that's very, very short notice. Again, there were no events called for A6. The A4 events were called in October after the enrollment kind of rollout occurred. And there were a few events for the other two, for some other subgroups that we won't be focusing on today. And so just another, this is something that we already heard during the prior presentation, and I'm sure everybody here is either program or evaluation practitioners. We know that 2023 was a relatively mild year, particularly compared to 2022. 2022 really was an extreme year. And here in this chart on the left here, what we kind of compared is essentially daily max temperatures and SDG&E system daily peaks for days in 2022 versus, in orange versus 2023, which are the blue triangles. And the event days are sort of, larger and filled in shapes. And so you can see quite a few 2022 events, quite a bit, both hotter and much higher peak loads. The 2023 events were both cooler and occurred under lower system peaks. And so really, essentially, this is the thing that we'll hear throughout this, is that 2023 was really not an extreme year, and 2022 was, and it's something important to keep in mind, given that ELRP is really intended as an emergency program. And we're going to dig in a little bit into the lack of impacts, at least for the A1 group. And as I mentioned before already, right, the impacts, the advance notice given was pretty short, and the sort of the reason for that, at least during the first couple events, is so the trigger for these ELRP events are EEA 1 warnings, and so or alerts, and CAISO issued those less than 1 hour in advance for the first two events, and so that was the source of the short notice. And even for that third July event on the 26th, even for that, the advance notice was given around noon for on the same day, and that also is in contrast for most of the 2022 events for which advance notice was given, more day ahead advance notice was given. And I'll just say here that we did some research. We did customer research also with SDG&E, with the A1 participants, and kind of wanted to understand both recall of events and barriers to participation and things like or response, things like that. This is a survey that was launched shortly after the 2023 events, and certainly day ahead notice was something that definitely the majority of these customers and participants said was important to them for response. So I think that's something to keep in mind for something like this. This is not technology enabled, unlike A4, where we definitely saw impacts. So yeah, definitely something to keep in mind is both this year was both not extreme and relatively short notice was provided. So getting into the ex post methodology and then the results. So A1 participants, and this is the same methodology actually we use for B2, same kind of approach. We wanted to make sure that we had a methodology that would accommodate both sort of the majority of customers, but that also had to carve out for sort of very large potential sites with potentially pretty noisy loads, which is definitely a component of the participant population for both A1 and B2. And so what we did was we first did an analysis where we were looking at the loads of and the size of the participants And we kind of first separated them out into, loads above or below, or like peak loads above or below 200 kW. And then we looked at, noisiness of the site. So we calculated CVRMSC, looking at the non-event day, summer loads. And basically we isolated sites that either, were both very large and had noisy loads, or who were in subsegments, for example, climate area or such that had just not enough sites to support the alternative method, which we use, which was difference and differences. So essentially, we used two different approaches: either difference and differences with the match controlled, or individual customer regressions, also with match or synthetic controls. And we used this triage approach to determine for which sites we would use either one. And I'll say that you heard Josh mention in the prior performance, or the prior presentation, that there was sort of a tournament approach to really focus on selecting the best match we could, and that's also the approach that we used here. And we did that. We took that approach for all sites, regardless of which methodology we were using. For those for which we used a difference and differences with match control directly, we just used that match control directly. For the individual customer regressions, we used the matches, matches, as kind of a right-hand predictive variable. And for A4, that's relatively small, pretty consistent loads. So for there, we used difference and differences of match control for everybody. And this just digs in just a little bit into that out of sample process for the control group selection. Essentially, what we're doing, we're focusing on non-event proxy days, so days that are similar in weather and load to event days. And we actually tested 8 different matching models, which included both propensity score matching and Euclidean distance matching. And we ran a bunch of, bias and fit statistics for each of those models, and used that to essentially select the best performing model, those with the best precision, or the lowest RMSE. And ultimately, we used the loads for the matches to determine either the counterfactual for the difference and differences with match control approach, or as predictive variables for the individual customer regressions. And just digging a little bit deeper into those individual customer regressions. So for the few hundred customers that we modeled, we actually determined or selected an individual or customized regression specification for each customer. And we actually looked across 4 different parameters. We had 4 different essentially sets of potential regressors that we could include in the model for each customer. Whether or not we include solar irradiance, which you can imagine is useful in predicting loads for customers with solar. The number of synthetic controls, everywhere from not including them to including all 5 of the matches that we had selected. There was a variety of lagged load variables, which we used to essentially simulate, among non-residential customers, often their loads can be a function of, for example, operational schedules. So we included a variety of lags, 1-day lag, 1-week lag, 2-week, et cetera, to simulate that. And then we also used industry profiles that were actually developed as part of some other work that we do, supporting NMEC evaluation in the EE world. So those were the 4 parameters, and here you just have on the left-hand side here, basically just counts of across the different sites, like how many of the different how many customers for which we were selecting each of these each of these individual customer regressions, which of them were included each of these various items in their customer regression. So you can see that there's quite a variety across them, which is really just shows that it's really helpful to include or to tailor the individual regression to each customer rather than choosing a single specification or maybe 2 or 3 specifications across hundreds of customers. And then rolling on into the actual results. So here's diving into those 3 2023 event days for the A1 and which is the non-residential group, and the B2 CPUC group. And you can see that there's really no significant impacts for the A1 group for any of the events. As compared to B2, we did not see significant impacts on the first day, but we did see some significant impacts on the subsequent days. And we don't really, I know that's might be a follow-up question, but we don't really know, we don't know the technical reason for why the B2 group was able to, respond on the latter 2 events. But I know that I do believe that they received some amount of, there might be also some communication through like CPUC communication they might be receiving. But I will say that these were not event days this year. So these were not dual event days. So, and just I think for context, it's really important to compare what we saw in PY 2023 to PY 2022. And on the left-hand side, you actually have the A1 ex post results for the average 2022 event. And on the right-hand side, you can see for the average 2023 event. And I'll just say that it's very, very clear that there was a substantial impact that's even just visible that you can see in the load shape from last year, whereas this year there really there's nothing visible in addition to nothing being inside of the margin of error. So that's just another thing that sort of as a reflection of what I already mentioned about in 2022 being an extreme year with day ahead notice, and it really seems to have resulted in clear impacts in PY 2022 that we did not see in PY 2023. In terms of B2, the difference is not as substantial. You see on the left-hand side, you can see the 2022 events. And then you can see the average 2023 event on the right-hand side. Similar magnitude of impact. What is interesting, though, is that the population for PY 2023 for B2 was actually over half of the population was different. And so one thing that I'll cover in a little bit in a few slides is that looking ahead to ex ante, we ended up opting to use the PY 2022 impacts to inform the ex ante model, given that we're trying to predict for an emergency event in an extreme year. But for B2, we ended up using the PY 2023 event information, given that the population was different. And then on the residential side, so again, there were no A6 impacts, but for the A4 virtual power plant, essentially battery storage group, we saw very clear impacts. There were 2 events in early October, relatively mild weather, but battery storage response is not really a function of having warm temperatures and AC load available to curtail. So we saw pretty clear impacts there. Each 2-hour evening events with about 3.5, just under 3.5 kW per site for those reductions, which is substantially more than the actual, the load on site. Because as you will see on this chart here, which is just looking at the difference results for those two events, with the observed load being in blue and the difference prediction being in the dotted gray line here, you can see that there's very, very clear impacts, very targeted to the two event hours, and there was clearly exports that were observed, and so these batteries were providing consistent, well-shaped exporting reductions across the two event hours for those two events. Now I'm going to switch over and talk about ex-ante. So the first piece for that is the enrollment forecast, which we help support the development of the enrollment forecast So the A1 group, so there have been some shifts in that population, but it's remained relatively consistent. So we have just kept that enrollment for that subgroup to be relatively flat. And we've done the same for the B2 group. For A4, which just got underway towards the end of the season in PY 2023, so there was just 335 sites enrolled. We assumed that for the next, I guess, subsequent 4 years after that we'd see 50% year-over-year growth. That is a high growth rate, but it's starting from a very small number, and that basically results in just shy of 1,700 sites being enrolled in 2027, which is a reasonable amount given the battery penetration in CG&E territory. For A6, which we did also forecast the enrollment growth for. It's relatively flat. So that group, I won't get into too much, but they're essentially sort of two means of enrolling. There's a very large auto-enrolled population of care customers, and then customers on the behavioral demand response program. This is the orange and the gray here on the right-hand side. And so there's very slight attrition there, but relatively flat. And then the forecast for basically the same level of growth that we saw in the last year for the auto-enrolled group, which is also sometimes referred to as opt-in also, and that's the blue. So the growth that we're seeing comes from that group, which is also a group where we actually see more reductions, given that these are more engaged, self-enrolled participants. And in terms of the inputs for the ex-ante methodology, so we take the percent impacts for actually a mix of PY 2022 and 2023, right? Like I mentioned, so like A1 and actually many of the other groups, we actually ended up using the PY 2022 results because they're more indicative of the extreme conditions that are expected for an emergency program like ELRP. For A4, and we used PY 22 and U2 because there were no PY 2022 impacts, plus the impacts are not expected to be as contingent on extreme weathers, being that they're battery storage driven. And for B2, we also used the PY 2023 impacts that I mentioned earlier is due to there being a substantially different population. And the B2 impacts, importantly, those are all incremental to any CBP impacts on dual event days. I just described the site enrollment assumptions that we used. And then for the reference loads, of course, we're using the specifications based on the ex-ante weather analysis, and we're doing the analysis specific to each weather station so that we can enable granular forecasting. All of this information is also used to inform not only an ex-ante forecast, but also a time temperature matrix and the slice of day estimates, which I'll I think I share. I think the last slide covers that. So importantly, so the reference loads, of course, are estimated based on the different ex ante weather specifications. And so those are a function of weather. Those increase with higher temperatures. However, the impacts that we saw are not actually in our modeling differentiated by weather condition. Of course, they're percent impacts. So when you apply the same percent impacts to a higher and higher load, you still produce higher megawatt reductions. But we did not overlay or try to model a weather differentiated percent impact model because there was basically not clear patterns for that in the observations that we saw across 23 and 2022. So here you can just see the hourly temperature in event hours. Each dot here is an event hour, and then the reduction as a percent of whole building load. And it's either they're quite flat, or there's just not enough. In the case of B2, there's not enough observations to really try to, and not enough observations across a wide enough temperature range to try to impute a weather pattern here. So this is why the model that we used is really static percent impacts regardless of temperature. And then just the resulting ex ante impact summary here. I'm just showing the portfolio adjusted impacts and the program specific impacts. And just as a reminder, the portfolio impacts are the incremental, so kind of the incremental impact over and above dual enrollment flows. So for example, if there were to be if there had been CBB days, which there were not in 2023, then this would show that. And actually, our portfolio and program predictions for B2 are the same because there were no there were no CBP event days, so there were no dual impacts. But altogether across the across the different groups, we have about 26 megawatts for the A1 group, which is in line with the 2022 ex post impacts, and A4 substantial impacts per site, but pretty low site count. So we expect that to grow from just under 1 megawatt to nearly 4 megawatts in 2027. A6, the group is that program is only approved through 2025. So the impacts there end after 2025. And the others seem to be flat. And then just the last piece here. So these are the slice of date impacts. Again, the differences across month are a function of those difference in reference loads. We're assuming stable percent impacts here. And of course, you can see the new window for the spring months from March through May there. But in terms of the variation across months, that's just the differences in the reference loads for both B2 and A1. And for A4, which you can see on the left here, that is entirely a function of the battery capacity. So there's actually no variation there. And I will say that for A4, it is a 5-hour window, but it's a 3-hour resource. So what we've modeled here is the average impact that you would or reduction that you would expect were for a 3-hour event, and we've just applied it to all 5 hours. A6 is an entirely behavioral program, so there we haven't restricted the impacts to the event window. Oftentimes with these behavioral programs, of course, assuming that more than a 1 hour notice would be provided. These were based on the 2022 impacts, which had day ahead notice. Those are the impacts there. So small, relatively small pre-event behavioral impacts. Any questions?
Andrew?
This is great. When it comes to the A4 load impacts, you said that you're taking, what could be done in a 3 hour and then just doing it for over the 5 hours. But
That's
when
right.
you were doing this, when you're doing these calculations, are these being done using the telematics data, or is this still at the meter, all of that?
That's a great question. Yeah, so we actually, so the short answer is it's based on the AMI data, but I will say that we actually also had access to the telematics data, and we performed an analysis on that data. Of course, we don't have control group data for telematics. So it was just a simple differences. We used the same proxy days, and we just compared participant load on loads on those proxy days, and but it was remarkably consistent, the impacts, and I believe those results are actually even included in the table generator as an option for A4. So they're very, very consistent, but yeah, the results are ultimately based on the differences with match control using the AMI data. And I'll say also, like, another thing that we saw is across and for these two events, they were both 2 hours in duration. But I think I mentioned we performed this analysis across the IUs, and something that we've seen, and something that we've also seen, in various program analyses that we've done, is that the impact is really a function, the way it is really a function of the battery, kind of the battery capacity itself, meaning the portion of the battery that the participants are, allowed to be controlled by the program. And so regardless of the duration of the event, it's a certain number of, I think it's about 7 kWh of impact, which, if it's a longer event, then you have a lower, impact in any given hour. If it's a shorter event, you have a larger, but it kind of, regardless of the dimensions of the rectangle, kind of the area is the same. And so that's how we were able to back into, okay, well, for a 3-hour event, what is the, what's sort of the kWh that you would want to spread, and just take that average, use that to derive an average kW, and then you can just apply that to the 5 hours.
Great. Okay. So speaking kind of these days that you use to create the control groups for your difference in difference modeling, do you know if they are similar to kind of our baseline setting days that are used to calculate incremental load reduction for actual compensation in the A4 program? Or so how are those actual event or those non-event days to create the control groups chosen?
Right. Yeah. So these proxy days we selected, I guess, like, at a high level, it's similar that we picked a set of proxy days for each event days. I think we picked them based off of SDG&E system load, because we wanted to make sure we're not just looking at days that have similar weather, but days that are going to, have system or load levels, and, be more, similarly likely to be picked for events and such. I know in the baseline there's a couple ways of doing it, but I think what's used for the settlements, which we also calculated, and basically we validated the calculations for that. That's looking at loads, but not at a system level. Basically looking at if you're for each individual site, I think it's an individual baseline. It depends on the program, or the subgroup. Similar but different concept, I guess. But the key difference with the baselines is that this is a pooled analysis, and because we're not selecting the days for the individual customers, we're selecting it at the system level. We're not we're not tending to always just select, necessarily the highest load days. We're just for those individual customers, we're just picking them in terms of the system.
So then maybe zooming in on A4 here, do we see, well, I guess firstly, I'm shocked at some of these values. They're just huge in this reduction. And I guess maybe this is for the SDG&E team, if you have a Rule 21 expert here, but when we're looking at, and maybe the next slide, these kinds of impacts here.
These are
obviously
KW, by the way.
Okay, great. Obviously, we can see that particularly clearly on the 10/5 day, there's that increase in load beforehand. So, I mean, these batteries, I guess then, are they being used in the regularly for some TOU arbitrage, and then on these event days, they are not like that increase in load is
there's a bit of
being used?
Yeah. So the way I think the short answer to some extent is yes, right? And so and the way to think about it is, and you're right, this lands this like divot here in the counterfactual load. It starts in hour 17, right, which is the beginning of the TOU window. And so essentially the way to think about this is to maximize the impact for this emergency event. What would otherwise have been used to respond to sort of the time of sort of that daily time of use window just is being delayed. So we can maximize the impact in the event hours. So yeah, I think that's why you're seeing that shape.
And like I said, and my next question is maybe for the Rule 21 team. Are customers in SDG&E territory, I guess, around California, are they able to export specifically from the battery, or is this an exemption that we gave specifically for ELRP A4? I don't know, Lizette, maybe do you know? I can't remember exactly what was done here.
Yeah, I think we're gonna get back to you on that question, right, Andrew?
Okay. I think that's it for me on questions. I guess I'll pass it on if someone else wants to raise their hand.
Does anyone else have any questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat. Okay, well, thank you, Lana, for your presentation. All right, if we don't have any more questions, then I think we can move to our break time. So it is now 10:48. If everyone could be back on the call by 10:59, that would be great. We'll see you all soon. All right, welcome back, everyone. While we wait for everyone to get back on the call, we can get SCE's summer discount program set up.
Yeah, of course.
All right, I think you should be good to start.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Savannah Horner. I'm a consultant at Demand Side Analytics. And today we're going to be going over Southern California Edison's summer discount plan, the 2023 evaluation. So at a very, there we go, the lag. At a very high level, this slide kind of reviews what the summer discount plan, or a little bit easier to say SDP, kind of covers. So essentially it works through the installation of a remote device that's installed on the participant's AC unit. And essentially what happens is it's a cycling strategy. So the device is on and off throughout the time period that an event is called. For SDP, events can be called year-round, but they only receive bill credits during the summer months of June through September. And also in the 3-4 years I've been kind of looking at this data, we haven't seen many called outside of that June to September window. What you'll see on this right-hand side is actually some of the documentation on SCE's website that kind of covers the summer discount plan for customers. Specifically, this table is looking at residential customers. And I think the big thing you kind of see here is the main options of maximum savings and then comfort. And so moving forward, we'll refer to these a little bit differently, but this is kind of how the customer has it framed to them as they sign up for participation. Maximum savings essentially means that you are in the 100% cycling group. So across the duration of the event, your unit is switched off for 100% of the time. Comfort is actually referred to kind of as we move forward as the 50% cycling group. And the way that that works is that each 15 minutes within a half-hour period, one set of 15 minutes, the AC unit is switched on, and the other 15 minutes, the AC unit is switched off. And so if you look at a full hour, you're getting 50% of the time the AC unit is theoretically switched off. These bottom two just kind of look at the ability for customers to override, which isn't actually a huge factor in the summer discount plan. So this is where you'll kind of see those 100%, 50% cycling. You'll also notice that there's a 30% cycling group. That is strictly for the commercial side of things. So residential is left to only pick between 50% and 100%, while those commercial customers can pick 30%. This whole table is just looking at the population in terms of the count of customers broken down by those cycling groups as well as the load control group. And these are the two main cuts that remain really important throughout the evaluation for the summer discount plan. Obviously, geography matters a lot because it has a big impact on the temperature. And then the 50%, or the cycling strategy also matters a lot because it's going to influence how big of impact you can receive for different groups. So these are kind of the main breakouts, and you can kind of see how customers are distributed across these different breakouts. I think some important things to note is that about 80% of the participants' tonnage and devices are in 100% cycling, and that is for both of residential and commercial. And that's really important because that's part of the reason why this delivers such big impacts is that customers are in 100% cycling and their units are shut off for the entire time that an event is called. Also, about 50% of resources are in the central sublap. So you can see here The central sublap is comprised of C1, 2, 3, and 4. And so that's these 4 top rows, and that's where we see the majority of customers. Just some other kind of anchoring thoughts is we do have about 30% of the residential customers are low income, so enrolled in CARE or FARA. And then I think the big one for commercial tends to be that schools and religious organizations account for about 81% of the tonnage. So schools and religious organizations make up a huge portion of the commercial population. As you can see by the actual quantities for commercial is much lower. There's between 6,000 and 7,000 customers enrolled, whereas residential has like 160,000. So there's a big difference there in the number of customers, but there is a lot of tonnage in both the commercial and residential, which obviously is important for an AC cycling program. And I've been sitting in on the previous presentations, and I think this has been a point of focus for everyone, but I just want to anchor it once again. Specifically for an AC cycling program, the weather is a big determinant of how much the program is going to be able to generate in savings. And so what we have graphed here is just a depiction of the previous 4 years. If you look at the top 20 hottest days, what do the average temperatures across those days look like? And 2023 is that purple line. So those top 10 days are lower than the previous 3 years. And then you kind of get into the mix for 2020 and 2021 when you get into those next 10. But again, there's lower temperatures we're dealing with, and for AC cycling, it's very important. And because of that, I think this is kind of a follow-up to that anchoring, where you can see here we graph the daily peak rank, and this is for the top 50 days, and you can see what the peak megawatts are for the SCE system. The blue lines actually indicate if an event was called. So you can see in the previous 3 years, there was a handful of events called, and there was always an event called on that very, very peak day. We don't see the same thing in 2023 because you can see the peak megawatts were considerably lower than the previous 3 years. And so the 2 events that were actually called were, I believe, for economic purposes and not necessarily an emergency. And so that made a big difference. And you can see that the 2 of them, I think that's a big thing moving forward with specifically ex post for SDP. Only having 2 events to look at, it's a little bit harder to draw broad conclusions because you're not seeing a whole range of temperatures and conditions going on in the territory. So I just kind of want to do a methods overview up front to kind of go through this. As we kind of saw earlier, there is a residential and a commercial sector, while SDP is dispatched as one across commercial and residential. We do analyze them independently because there's different factors that we need to control for. So the way you'll see is we'll kind of overview the methodologies, and then we'll look specifically at residential, and then we'll look specifically at commercial. And that'll kind of give you the taste of how those 2 may have performed similarly or differently across this summer. So for estimating the ex post demand reductions, it's basically boiled down. It's a 3-step process where the first step is selecting 3 proxy days for each event day that was called. So this bottom graph is just illustrative. This is actually from last year, but it's a little bit easier to see what we're talking about when we talk about proxy days on this graph because there are more days involved. But you can see here that solid blue line is the event day, and then the different variations of dotted lines are proxy days. And so the goal is to pick a set of days that are similar in magnitude and similar in shape to the event day. And so you can kind of see how that happens across those event days from last year. The next step is actually generating a mapped control for each of our participants based on their individual load during those proxy days. So we use those days, obviously, because those are unperturbed load. And there's some things that we find to be to be pretty important in creating these matched controls. So for residential, whether or not you're a solar customer is really important, because obviously that affects how you are consuming load across the day. The climate zone is important because the weather is a big factor for residential. And then the general size of the customer. So whether they're a larger residential customer or a smaller residential customer, that kind of helps those determinants. And on the commercial side, it's quite different, right? You see that it's industry and size. And so because commercial is a less weather dependent sector, things like climate zone don't really mean as much. It's actually more important to look at things like industry. And so we hard match on those, which means that all of our match controls, the participants in the controls have these same characteristics when they're matched. And then from that point, we do a propensity score matching with replacement to get the best match for the individual load on those proxy days. And then the final piece is, I think, pretty similar to other things that have been talked about today, but it's basically a difference in difference panel regression, where for each event day, we take that proxy event day, we net out the difference between the treatment and the control groups if there were no intervention, and kind of understand what those differences between treatment or control. And through that, we're able to define the hourly impacts across actual events. And like I said, a lot of the important pieces for SDP are those cycling strategies and geographic regions. And so we produce a whole bunch of cuts, but again, it's really important to us that we make sure that we're estimating those subcategories specifically. And so once we're able to, get the ex post calculations generated for a given year, we can kind of see how those vary based on temperature, the hours of dispatch, the length of dispatch, things like that. So we do some analysis on that. And then with the end goal of trying to get to the ex ante impacts, making sure there's a standardization for weather, full dispatch of resources, you'll actually see in this current year, there were a couple load control groups that weren't dispatched on given event days, but we do assume for ex ante impacts that there's full dispatch, standardization of the hours and the length of dispatch, and then just the ever-changing, obviously, project enrollment. And through those, we were able to generate the ex ante impacts and understand what the magnitude of program resources are under the different weather conditions. So Edison's and CAISO's 1 in 2 and 1 in 10, and kind of understanding what those look like. So it's just a really high overview of the methods. We will get into a couple more specifics on how those are performed, but I think it's a good time to hop into the residential side of things. So what we're looking at here is the residential ex post impacts. And since there were only 2 events, you can see both of these right here. I think the very first important thing to point out is that July 20th event day, you can see up here, it lasted from 7:45 to 8:35. So it didn't actually include a full hour of event. It included 15 minutes from the 7 to 8 o'clock hour, and then 35 minutes from the 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock hour. So when you look at this on an hourly basis, it looks a little bit different than the August 16th event day, which actually included 2 full event hours. And so this is kind of what we're used to seeing with SDP, is you have this drop off that lasts across your event hours, and it almost just looks like a flattened U. Obviously, with that July event, because we don't have those full event hours, we don't see the straight downs that we might normally see in previous years, which makes a lot of sense for how these events were dispatched. So I think another important piece to point out here is that on the July event, West 1 was excluded from dispatch, and then in the August event, it was Central 3 that was excluded. So in each of these events, there's actually a single load control group that wasn't dispatched, and that's for various reasons. So you can see when you look at the total amount of accounts that were called for each of these event day, they're a little different. And then when you look at the average event, what we intended to do was see what it looked like if there was full dispatch across these event days. So that July event delivered about a 50 megawatt reduction across those 2 event hours. Again, like I said, partial event hours, so that is a little bit, when you average that across 2 full hours, it's a little bit lower than what you can see. In the 8 to 8:30 window, the impact was actually 73 megawatts. But more of what I think is everyone was interested in is looking at that August event day where you did have full dispatch, and it was about a 92 megawatt reduction across those 2 hours. I think another really kind of important thing to note with cycling programs is you don't really see that decay across hours because it's the 2nd or 3rd hour of the event. The main difference here between the 6 to 7 o'clock window and the 7 to 8 o'clock window is how much load is actually available to be reduced. Because as time changes, people are using load differently, and so that's the main difference between those 2 hours on that event day. And it is a fairly significant percent reduction. So for that July event, it was about 14%, and then August about a 25% reduction in load. And so it really shows you the magnitude of what the summer discount plan can provide, even on conditions that may not be as hot as typical. You can see here the different temperatures on those 2 event days. Definitely nothing crazy. It's more cooler than previous years, but you can still see those big reductions across those hours. So this just looks at it at a very high level, while this slide kind of breaks it down a little bit more granularly. And so the difference here is when we look at it on a granular level, understanding the megawatt reduction isn't as important because obviously the megawatt reduction is influenced by the number of participants that were dispatched. So this actually looks at it on a per participant basis. So what did each participant deliver? Because that kind of takes away the different magnitudes across those different regions. So this is kind of the, this will kind of get you situated. This is what the July and August events looked like across all participants on a per participant basis, with the gray indicating August and the blue indicating July. And so I think the first thing to point out here is the different cycling strategies. So you can kind of see the difference between the two. Obviously, 100% cycling is going to have a larger reduction because of just the mechanics of how the cycling strategy performs. But I think it's important to note that the 50% cycling does not inherently equal half of 100% cycling. And that is because your unit may not be on specifically in times where it's not extremely hot. Your unit may not be on for all 60 minutes of the hour. And so that makes a difference, especially with 50% cycling, because that means that the time where that 15 minutes where the unit is switched off, it may not have been running anyways. And so that creates a little bit of difference. So it's not just a 1-to-2 ratio between those two cycling groups. You can also see here kind of how this changes across the different load control groups. I think for this case, it's probably more beneficial to look at the full hour events in August to understand kind of how the different load control groups performed. And so you see Central 1 and Central 4 had a pretty hefty reduction, as did Low Desert. Obviously, Low Desert is a fairly small population, so this can kind of swing either direction depending on the event day and the weather conditions and how individual customers perform. But I think we tend to see that the Central Sublab delivers some pretty hefty load reductions across event hours. And then things like low income and solar are also graphed here. There obviously are some differences, but I think there's less of a conclusion to be drawn here, especially just with 2 event days. And so this is kind of the graph we look at to start to situate how we're going to produce the ex ante impacts with including the newest year of data. And so Again, like I said, that combination of cycling strategy and load control group is really important. And so that's what we use. What you see on this graph is the previous 4 years. We plot the participant weighted temperature against the impact per participant. For those 4 years, you can kind of see the different shapes. So the purple triangle is the 2023 event hours. They're a little bit harder to find in the graph because there's not nearly as many of them. But I think, you can definitely pinpoint the 2022 event hours, those blue circles. And what you kind of see here is just the trend across all of these different groups. So we actually do our ex ante modeling in these different squares, essentially. And the reason is because you can kind of just visually see here that the slope changes depending on which quadrant you're in and which square you're in. 50% cycling tends to be a little bit flatter slope. So that's why it's really important we break that out. And then you can see even here in the 100% cycling group, especially across the central sublaps, there's definitely different slopes and that are pretty tight across these 4 different central sublaps. And so that's why we find it so important to do our ex ante modeling on this level, to make sure that we're not kind of obscuring away from any of these differences that we do know exist. Again, it's important to remember that the population varies in each of these boxes. It's a different population that we're looking at. So you can see for low desert, the 50% cycling, this group is an extremely small group. I think it's like maybe 20 customers. And so you can kind of see that spread here, whereas the central groups that have a lot more customers in them are a little bit tighter. They also have these different load control groups have different event history. Like we were talking about earlier, for this previous year, there were certain load control groups that weren't dispatched. So doing our modeling at this level ensures that we're not modeling for any event days that didn't occur for a customer. We're only looking at event days that occurred in these different groups. And so that's kind of why we do our modeling on this level. And we typically use the previous 3 to 4 years of data. And there was actually some discussion on what to use this year. And so we ended up using the previous 4 years of data, including the current event year. And the primary reason for that is because there were so few events that occurred in 2023. We took away a lot of the event data that we had from 2020, which incurred a lot of events, and only added in 2 data points. And so it made the model a lot less precise and wasn't as fully formed as we'd like it to be. And so we used those 4 years for the ex ante modeling this year. And so through that, right here, you can see on the left-hand side, 2024 forecast year for 1 and 2 August peak day. And you can kind of see some of the details surrounding this. Again, you can see that shape that we're kind of used to seeing in the summer discount plan that kind of drops and then stays around the same place across the full event hour window. And what we're kind of seeing is about 138 megawatt reduction in this August 1 and 2 2024 peak day, which is about a 35% reduction. So if you remember what we talked about for residential ex post this year, obviously those percent reductions were a little bit lower, but the weather conditions this year just weren't extreme. And so, that kind of makes sense to why we'd be at that place. And I think it's also important to point out that the enrollment forecast for residential plays a pretty large part in the ability to deliver the amount of megawatts that this program does. Because residential, the per customer basis, as you could see, in most cases it was below 1 kilowatt, but when you aggregate it up this large, it becomes a lot bigger and a lot more of a program to be concerned about. And so you can kind of see here the enrollment forecast is actually declining, but declining very slowly, or forecast to decline very slowly across the next couple of years, which I think is really good to see, because I think for a while it was, after 2020, there was kind of a drop off in customers enrolling in SDP and customers and an increase in customers that were de-enrolling from SDP because of the number of events that were called. But we haven't seen that issue in the past couple of years. And so now it kind of seems like maybe the program has stabilized out and we can kind of have a better handle into the future of what that enrollment forecast looks like. And again, you can see since the enrollment forecast is only declining so slightly, megawatt impacts across these years are fairly similar. So if you look at the Edison 1 in 10, in 2024, it's 152 megawatt reduction. And in 2027, it's 151.7. And so this is really a program where the number of customers enrolled matters a lot. And then the final piece that we want to look at for residential is just getting a comparison of where the ex-ante estimates from this year align with previous year's ex-ante estimates. And so this, again, we're looking at this on a per customer basis since enrollment has changed across the years. And we're looking at it for 2021, 2022, and 2023. We will say that across these years, the modeling is a little bit different. So we're using different years to model the reference loads, and again, different years to model the impacts. And so there is some different levels of data going into it. But you can actually see here that all three of these lines kind of intersect with each other. And part of that is because that there's consistent years across these three modelings. So I think, 2020 played a part in all three of the previous modelings, which it was a really important year. I mean, I think it really showed what the SDP program could provide, specifically the residential side. And so that's why you kind of see these similarities across. But there are also differences do exist, and they exist because the modelings are a little bit different. But I think this is you can kind of see here that across June through September in 1 and 2, a customer is going to deliver, somewhere between 0.8 and 0.9 kilowatts, and then in 1 in 10, somewhere between 0.9 and 1.15. And so you can kind of get that temperament to understand where the program will land for individual customers. So that's the residential side. We'll move into the commercial side now. I will say a lot of the statements surrounding specifically ex post event days will stand for the commercial side, because like I said, if the program's called for residential, it's called for commercial as well. So you're kind of seeing those same minutia in the times and such. This right here is just looking at a graph that shows you the accounts, devices, and tonnage, and the share that's in each of the different industries. And I know I mentioned up front that schools, which in this case are that dark gray, and religious organizations, which are kind of that bright green, account for a lot of the devices and tonnage. But this just really kind of situates that idea. As you can see here, they don't make up nearly the amount of accounts. It's just that they are a hefty portion of the actual load reductions that could be delivered. And that's obviously really important because those are two industries where there's definitely some really large differences in how they operate. The first being schools, right? So this program runs typically over the summer. That's when most of the events are called. And schools are actually not 100% in session over the summer. And so I think a big component for the commercial side of things is whether or not schools are in session. That's really going to dictate a large portion of what impacts could be and what that megawatt reduction could be. Interestingly enough, right, religious organizations are a little bit different because they almost exclusively operate on the weekend, but there's definitely a higher attendance over the weekend, which kind of is the opposite of schools. And it's interesting too, because for a while there haven't been a ton of weekend events. And so depending on whether you're calling on a weekday or a weekend, that's going to impact the magnitude that a religious organization can deliver. So this just kind of situates that idea that what really matters more for commercial is whether school's in session and it's a weekday or a weekend versus the actual temperature. And so you can kind of see that in these graphs from the July and the August event. First of all, just take a look at the shapes. you can see that there's definitely a difference in the full load shape across these two events. And that's because you're getting into August, you're getting into school, whereas July school is definitely not in at that time. I think one thing people might notice immediately in these graphs is that for the commercial side, the impact is about 1 megawatt for the July event. And again, that's primarily because you don't have schools in session. You know, depending on what type of religious organization it is, they may not be having a lot of AC load during a weekday, but you can kind of see there's just less load to be reduced across those event hours for the commercial side. And again, they are partial hours. And so if you go a little bit more granular, maybe say look at 15-minute data, maybe you do see that drop a little clearer, but definitely on an hourly level, it becomes obscured a little bit for commercial. But not to fear, right? If you look at the August side, this is kind of, again, what we're used to seeing with SDPC, is kind of this load shape. And an interesting thing, right, about the commercial load shapes is the later into the day you get, pretty much for the most part, regardless of industry, you're going to see a pretty steep drop off in load as people leave work and go back to their homes. And so the later in the day an event is called for SDPC, the less load is available for reduction. But for this August event, there was about a 12 megawatt reduction across the 2 full event hours, which is about a 10% reduction. So again, fairly substantial. Obviously, there's a lot more load going on at commercial facilities than maybe a residential house where it's primarily AC and lighting and whatnot. And so this, you know, obviously kind of makes sense based on the 2 events that were called, and just kind of situates what that commercial looks like, A, when school's in session, and B, if it's called on a partial event hour. So similarly to residential, we do ex ante modeling on the load control group and cycling strategy level. The problem with graphing that out for you right now is instead of 20 boxes, it becomes 30, and it's almost imperceptible to see what's actually going on. So we kind of look at what the different cycling strategies perform illustratively, although the modeling is done on the same load control group and cycling strategy level. I think the first thing we want to kind of point out here is that we actually used a different set of years for commercial than we did for residential. So we used 2018, 2019, 2022, and 2023 to model ex ante. 2021 and 2020 were excluded because of COVID effects. We kind of did some analysis back in 2020 and 2021 and found that the actual impact on loads was not large for the residential sector, which is why those years were included for residential. But for the commercial load, it really affected the load and therefore the amount of impacts that could be attained. And so it just didn't feel like those 2 years adequately represent what this program can actually produce, which is why we don't use them. And we didn't use them last year either. So this is just continuing to carry that forward. I think one thing when you look at these different cycling strategies is it gets tighter as you go from 30 to 100, and that's fully dependent on the population that's included. Obviously, a smaller population is going to get you a little bit of a wider spread, whereas in that 100% cycling, where most of the participants lie, it gets a little bit tighter. And then I think it's also important to note, this is something that's been interesting across the years to me working on a summer discount plan. 50% cycling actually has the lowest average tonnage per device. So that really makes a difference when you look at things on a megawatt scale. A lot of the 30% cycling customers have opted for 30% cycling for a reason. And part of that reason is they're fairly large customers. And so they can actually deliver some hefty reductions, although there are few of them. And again, 100% cycling kind of is where the majority lives. So you kind of see an average there, and 50% while you may imagine it sits in the middle, it does have the low average tonnage per device to be able to be reduced. And I think an important thing with commercial, even more maybe than residential, is especially as you get closer to those lower temperatures, you're getting impacts that are near zero. Obviously, again, it's not as temperature dependent, but if there's really no cooling load going on at those lower temperatures, you're not going to get any substantial impacts. So this is that same kind of graphic we looked at for residential, but just on the commercial side. And what you can kind of see here is, again, like we talked about, this load shape for the August 1 and 2 peak day for the year of 2024 kind of has that similar load shape and similar impacts that we saw in the ex post August event day from 2023. And what we see here is approximately a 16 megawatt reduction, which is about a 7.5% reduction across that 4 to 9 p.m. window. I think one of the things, like I said, is important here is the enrollment forecast. And this is really similar to residential, where enrollment for a while was kind of dropping off and now it's kind of levelized, which is great to see. And you can also see for the commercial side, the total amount of devices. And so, you know, most houses, maybe they probably typically maybe have 1 or 2 AC units, but when you get into the commercial sector, obviously you're getting a lot more devices that can be installed across a given participant, which is why I think the commercial side of this program is so important, is although it's small in the number of customers, these customers can produce some fairly large reductions, and it's not that many that you're handling. And part of it is because the total amount of devices and tonnage that they provide to this program. Similarly to residential, kind of as you go across the years, you're not seeing a drastic decline. And again, that's just directly related to the enrollment forecast. Something I will say about commercial, though, is it's more prone to, if there's a very large customer that leaves the program, you know, that will swing it a little bit more than if, you know, a customer leaves the residential side. And again, it's just because the amount that are in there, there's not enough room to balance it out if a large customer leaves, and that's not possible to predict. And so that's something that as you move forward throughout the years, like maintaining those relationships with those customers, and even in just the data side, seeing if you drop out a large customer is really important to understand how those impacts might change. And this is that same kind of graph that situates you to understand how the ex ante impacts have changed across the years. This kind of is a little bit tighter for commercial than it is for residential, because we've seen pretty consistent conditions for our commercial customers across, you know, those set of 4 years that we've been using. And you can see here on a per device basis, because again, those devices are an important piece, but on a per device basis, you're seeing anywhere between a 0.2 kilowatt reduction and a 0.4 in a 1 in 10 condition. And so you can, again, kind of bracket off what you intend to see for these customers. There's obviously a little bit smaller of a range for commercial. And again, it's just because of the, it's not as a weather dependent of a program. Yeah, so then we can hit on the discussions and recommendations and then kind of move on into questions. A lot of these are things I've kind of mentioned throughout. SDP very much has the ability to deliver large magnitude flexible load reductions at very quick rates, right? Because it doesn't require a customer to make any sort of decision. You know, the switch is installed on the AC unit, and if it needs to be enacted, you know, that can be done very quickly, which is really important, obviously, for the most extreme weather when resources are needed the most. And there is, across residential and commercial, about roughly 1 million tons of air conditioning load enrolled in this program, which is obviously a lot. and it's why this program is so important. And kind of like I've mentioned in these slides where we've looked at comparisons across years, there has been increased attrition, which were originally because there were a higher number of events, but we haven't really seen that. There's been kind of I think a concerted effort to make sure that not too many events are being called, so that customers aren't being fatigued, which I think was extremely important after 2020. But we're kind of seeing that plateau now, which is really good to see, to understand kind of where that is going to reside for the future years. And I think because of the limited number of events that were called this year, I think some of our recommendations kind of revolve around maybe developing a testing event plan for the summer of 2024, because having to use 4 years of data does mean we're looking back 4 years, and sometimes programs can change significantly over that time frame. And we obviously do understand, I think, going back to the attrition over the years, there is a desire to not fatigue the customers. And so in developing some sort of testing plan, it would be important, right, to make sure that you aren't calling 10 events for every single customer, but maybe calling different load control groups individually, so not dispatching them fully all at once, and kind of getting a larger range of temperatures. I think what we have right now is almost the two tail ends of weather conditions that the program may be deployed, because we do have some of those very extreme years, while also having, like this year, a year that maybe in theory SDP was never actually needed to be deployed. And so we kind of have those two bracketing, but it's really important to get a really high level understanding of what's going on in all of those middle ranges. And then I think like the next piece of that is just that in this kind of testing plan, you can make sure that you understand exactly what's going on in areas where maybe holes exist. Obviously, again, a lot of the previous years, events were called for emergencies. So I don't think anyone's worried about making sure that hour ending 21 had an event called on it so that it could be estimated well in future years. That's not the priority. But it's important for ex ante predictions to have a full range of events. And I think that's part of the, I wouldn't say difficulties, but just like something to keep at the forefront of our minds, is that, there are no hour 21 events called, and there are currently no events that we're looking at that last longer than 4 hours. And so to be able to model ex ante well, it would be nice to have those things, although it's not, definitely not a requirement specifically because the program is not made for evaluation, but is made for load reductions, and we definitely get that. And so I think that's just like it's like the nice to haves, but would be really helpful for making sure that ex ante is correctly specified. And I think that's it. Any questions from anyone?
I think all of the questions heard. While everyone else is thinking of their questions, I had one. Could you go into a little bit more about how you calculated your enrollment forecast, or you or someone else?
Yeah, so it's actually the enrollment forecast for SDP is provided by Southern California Edison. So I don't know if they have any more of a detail into that.
Michael?
Anyone from SCE here want to comment on enrollment forecast assumptions? Or do we not have any SCE in attendance today?
I think Michael has his hand up. Is that for another question or is that for enrollment forecasts?
Michael, I think you're muted still.
Sorry, I was just talking to nobody, I guess. But yeah, so the enrollment forecast is based on historical averages. I don't really have the exact assumptions in front of me, but if you need something more specific, I can get that to you.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Did anyone else have any questions? Okay, well, hearing no further questions, thank you very much, Savannah.
Thank you.
I think that concludes our workshop for today. Thank you to everyone who presented and to all of our attendees. We will see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for day 2 then. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to all the presenters today, and thanks for everyone for participating. See you tomorrow.